Today we're going to deal with the HP2 Sport BMW. We're going to paint the valve covers. These are high temperature parts that I don't know if this is really going to work out the way I want, but we're sure going to give it our best try. And of course, for this bike, this is rare. It's only one of 200 in the country. We're going to give it our best shot at some real quality work. Now we're working in the shop on 3 different restoration projects, the BMW, a Moto Guzzi, and a Buell. We're posting a video every day of the progress we make, and we're prioritizing things according to Vlad. And he prefers that we get the BMW done because he wants to ride it ASAP, of course. And then we're going to work on the Buell, and the last one, the last project of the 3 is the Moto Guzzi Daytona. And they're all designated with the letter V. Now on this video today, we're going to try to share some, I think it's going to be interesting information if you've never used high temperature resin, high temperature paint, painted parts like mufflers, headers. And in this case, what we're going to try to do today is Vlad has on his HP2 Sport, he has carbon fiber valve covers. I'm not sure if they're accessory or if they came with the bike, it doesn't really matter. And these are pretty high-tech parts. I'm sure they're made with high temperature resin. And I'm going to try to explain some of this in the course of the video. But one of the things we have to really be always aware of when you're doing anything with high temperature resin, high temperature paint, is a lot of the fumes from this stuff can be really toxic and can be, especially the resin. So you always want to have good ventilation, always wear a mask, etc. But this is not the purpose of the video. The purpose is Vlad, and I spoke to him about this, and he's willing to take a chance that we can use our automotive paint, which is typically good from 150 to 165 degrees, the 4-to-1 paints. And that means that if we were to exceed that temperature, this paint may deteriorate. I don't know at what rate. I don't know if it will at all, and I don't know how hot. I wish it was summer. I could take my laser thermometer and measure like a BMW after a run if how hot those valve covers get. I don't know. It's going to be experimental, but one thing, at the end of it, we're going to know something we didn't know before, and we'll try to share what we learn. Now, of course, we're dealing with high temperature parts. I thought it would be really useful to know. Some people don't know. A 2-cycle engine, typically the exhaust is between 100 and 150 degrees cooler than a 4-cycle. So when you take into account if you're going to paint the exhaust pipes, the headers, this is going to be a lot cooler than the counterpart on a 4-cycle bike. And I made exhaust systems, many for model airplanes, with high temperature resin. The resin that worked beautifully for the 2-cycle engines, nitromethane burning engines, did not work at all on the 4-cycle engines. It melted. So you always want to be aware, the first little bit of information, no matter what you think, a 2-cycle engine runs cooler than a 4-cycle engine most of the time, and I would say probably there's exceptions, but that's something you need to be aware of. Now, an example, the tuned exhaust systems that go on my RD, I have 2 sets of them, and they're done with 2 different kinds of paints. It held up pretty well, but again, that's not a 4-cycle part. Now, what I did when I made the exhaust system that was originally on this bike for about the first 7 or 8 years I had it, I used Huntsman resin, high temperature resin. It's good to 500 degrees. These parts, and I measured them with my laser thermometer, never even got close to 500 degrees. They actually are spaced, so air is in between them. And these held up perfectly over the years. Again, this is Huntsman high temperature resin. But the problem is, and this is information I wanted to share, these aren't painted. There's no paint on here. What I did is I put extra resin over them and then buffed and sanded the resin. And that, of course, that's the nuclear option. But when you do it that way, you're never going to have anything melt because that resin is pretty much a 500 degree resin. Now, because we're going to be doing the BMW valve covers, what we're going to try to do is, and I made these parts, I made the sheet, and then I coated them with the exact paint we're going to use today, the Gavco, and these don't get hot. So this resin with that finish, pretty much a forever job. It held the polish beautifully over the years, and this is way over 10 years old now. But what we're going to try to do is mimic this finish on the valve covers of the BMW, and hopefully they will not deteriorate or have any issue with the paint peeling or discoloring. But again, it's an experimental thing we're doing. I'm not telling people to run off and do this until Vlad rides the bike and we find out. Another thing, keep in mind, they make special caliper paint. It's usually flat, but they do make gold and they do make silver. But it's caliper paint, because these calipers under certain conditions, and probably race conditions more than anything else, these get red hot. You almost can't touch them. So it's a good idea if you're restoring a bike to spend the money, get a can of caliper paint, and I'll show all these later on in the video, so that you don't spend all your time and then the paint fails very soon in service. Now, when I did the work on the Suzuki, I painted these with regular automotive paint. They held up to a point, not perfectly. They held up many, many years, but again, I wanted something a little bit shinier than caliper paint, and as I'm taking a brake dust off with my finger, they held up okay, but I would always suggest to use caliper paint. And to be honest, when I did this restoration with the gold and the black, everything on the bike gold and black, and I had mixed my own gold paint, I was thinking of making the calipers gold, but I didn't want to run the risk that years later that paint would start to deteriorate. So I used regular, ordinary caliper paint. Now, this is just for information sharing. This is the clear that we're going to use today. But keep in mind, see the word high temperature? Anytime you have high temperature paint, that's wrinkle finish. There's engine paint, there's header paint, but the word high temperature, and it usually will tell you what temperature range this paint is good for. And every brand of paint makes high heat paint. The barbecue paint is usually flat paint. This is high temperature. Caliper paint. Look at the temperature. It's good to 900 degrees. Well, that tells you, I don't think any part of an engine ever going to get to 900 degrees. The caliper paint you could use for an engine for sure. But the paint we're using is ordinary Color-Right paint, and ordinary, this is 2000 degree high heat paint. It's usually ceramic, and that's usually special paint. And some of it can be expensive, but you got to pick the right paint for the job. But today we're going to go through our supply, but we're going to use Gavco. So these are the parts we've done already. These are the HP2, the fenders, the back hugger, and we got the tail section of the Buell over there. They dried up absolutely beautifully, but today we'd like to work on those valve covers. And this, again, keep in mind, this is an experimental test, but we want to share what we learn. So these are the parts we're going to work on today. These are the valve covers from the HP2. Vlad said he'd cleaned them. I'm going to clean them thoroughly, and I'm going to sand them. Of course, there's some deep scratches in some of them, some defective areas where there's some roadkill on there and everything. But we're going to try to do this to make this finish on here like one of our custom finishes. But again, this is experimental stuff. Now there is a chance, and I always try to think of a nuclear option. One of the choices we would have, if this clear that's on here deteriorates, we can use paint remover and get it off, and then buff these. Now I suggested to Vlad that might be what we want to do originally, is buff them. He wants to put clear on it. And again, the customer is always right. So, and we'll try to learn something here. We still need to get the white paint for this part. We haven't even considered what we're going to do with the Moto Guzzi. There's Buell parts left to do, more Buell parts. And it would be nice, we probably could do some paint on the fairing, some clear, but the wind is howling out there today. We need a day where the wind isn't howling, and I need to make some kind of a way of holding that in place. Now, it has the look that these parts were made in a female mold and vacuum bagged, and they're beautifully made, needless to say, but of course they've had oil in them for many, many years. Both sides, so you would think, hopefully we got most of it out, but we're going to spend a little bit more time than we normally would. I want these to soak in simple green, and I'm going to take them over to the slop sink, and again, I want that to just sit there. This really gives me a little bit of concern painting these parts, because I don't know how hot these get in reality, but again, you never know if you don't try something. And in this case, it's the best of all worlds. It's Vlad's bike, and we learned something, and if it doesn't work out, Vlad, we're just kidding you. Anyway, this is always choice one. Let the simple green sit a minute or two. Now, what I'm going to do, because these were done in a part that would always have oil. I'm really concerned that we're going to have a possibility of, maybe a real possibility, we're going to have a fisheye issue. If we do, we're going to deal with that separately, but whenever I'm doing something that I haven't really done and I don't really know what the outcome is going to be, I'm a little concerned, but again, I'm always willing to learn, and when I learn something, I always enjoy passing it on, thinking that at least from anything we learn, somebody else may benefit too. It's like 2 for the price of 1. Anyway, I'm going to finish cleaning these up, and we'll get ready to sand them out. Now, one final step in the cleaning, SOS pads. Boiling hot water, as hot as you can stand it on your hands. Get the last bit of that grease off. And one final cleanup step, I took brake parts cleaner and just soaked them using a whole can and wiping it off 3-4 times. I wanted to get every bit, every drop of oil I possibly could get off of those parts. So with the parts degreased, now we can look real close at what we have to do to repair these. There's a giant scratch up here. And we're going to use 400 sandpaper, wet, soapy water, of course. I'm going to ultimately block that off with some tape so we don't get any paint down in there. And I'm looking, this one was chewed up on the bottom. Before we do anything, we want to get rid of all these scratches and some parts up here that are pulled apart. Now, it would be nice if we knew, this would be the nicest thing if we knew, that this was a carbon fiber part and they painted it, but there's no way I reasonably can tell right now. And a lot of times what they do when they do a female mold, they paint resin into the mold first. And so that this is the finish of the mold. So in that case, it comes out beautiful, like the parts I have on my MT-09 are made that way. But I don't know for sure on this, but after we sand it down and get some clear on it, well, we're going to see how this works out. So 400 sandpaper and some really hot soapy water. In this case, I put extra soap in because of the oil on these parts. So to sand out of the part, a little bit time consuming. I put everything in fast forward, but it's the detailing, sanding it out and then wiping it off, resanding it, looking for little shiny spots or spots. There's a lot of little imperfections, little chips in the paint. Remember, these BMW cylinders stick right out by the road. Every stone chips them up. They really do take a beating. But anyway, we managed to, just being patient, taking our time, and wipe the part off, and then detail. When I'm happy with it, I detail it with a sanding block. Sanding block, getting all the little valleys, all the little nicks, crannies, as many as possible. And I'd like the part to be etched, scratched, and dull before I even consider doing any work with paint. Because once the degreasing of this part took a lot longer than I thought it would, but I wanted it to be perfect. And I didn't put the whole process on the video. It just took a lot of time. And there's a lot of little things I went back and sanded out. There's one you can see right there on the left. And these are little flaws in the paint, chips, things that had to be done over. And there's no other way I know of. Here's one before I started, the second one. And there's no other easy way to do this than to just go back and forth. And those spots that look dull or gray, or where you've sanded, where there's a scratch or an error, we hope that the clear is going to cover them quickly. So sanding out the second part, it went a little bit faster because it didn't have that oil filler cap to deal with and all the detailing that goes around it. But I wanted to make sure I got down into all the valleys. The most important part to sand is down in the valleys of all of these parts. This is a pretty complex part to sand, and you're always tempted to just, that's good enough, that's good enough. But if you go back and forth, and every time you do it, the part will get a little bit nicer. And we're hoping I can get the whole part done here and not have sanded through into the raw carbon. That's just taking care not to do that. If I do that, it's going to be a little bit extra work trying to make it look like there's no seam there. But lastly, and this is the part that really matters, I wanted to wipe these. This is Sicken's M600 degreasing agent. Prep All would be good. Lacquer thinners would even be good, to be honest. Acetone would be okay. These are high temperature resins. So when I got done with this, to drain the compressor, I've gone through that on a previous video, and the Harbor Freight gun, put some tape around the top, mix up some Gavco. I want to hope that the wind is not going to be blowing terribly. So the weather looked like it was going to be cooperative today. Still a little chilly in the low 40s. Got out the table, and if you only had any idea how many motorcycles and things have been painted on that table, holy mackerel. That table has served me well. And take the parts out in the sun, make sure there's no spot I still need to address, because once I start painting, pretty much from that point on, I'm married for this step. And it looked pretty good. Now, notice what I did. I pressed the trigger down when the spray gun was not near the part, and I'm not letting the trigger back off until I'm done painting or until I have to stop and move the part. I'm not holding the trigger up against the gun, on the trigger on the gun, and then spraying. And that's one way, when you're using these inexpensive guns, you can avoid getting little spits out the end of the gun when the material starts to drip. It's a good little tip, by the way. And with the first coat laying down here, you can get some idea. The sun was shining, so obviously it looks really nice. I got the other part out. Same thing, is not to keep pulling the trigger back and forth. Pull it back, go over to the part, paint it, take the gun away so you're spraying out in midair. And now here I have to move this again because I'm trying to paint into the sun to candle this. The way this part is, it's not a big part, so I don't have to worry. And we're going to get several coats on there before the day's over, but not pressing a trigger and releasing it, pressing it and releasing it. And in this case, on a small part like this, it's good in between coats. Just go have a cup of coffee. And if you put 5 coats, 3 coats, no matter how many coats you're going to put on, always better, the general rule I use is it's always better to have low pressure on the gun, have it spraying like a big airbrush, and put a lot of coats on, because it takes, the downside of that is it takes a long time to paint a part. But here, we're not painting a car. Painting 2 little parts like this, it's going to add maybe 10 minutes to the whole job. But boy, in return, what you get, the quality of the way the paint lays out, and boy, just looking at that paint table, you think a few things have been painted on that. And then I put it out in the sun on the picnic table, went and had a cup of coffee, looked at it. As soon as I can touch it with my finger, then usually that's in this temperature 20-30 minutes, and I put the second coat on, and that paint laid down like glass. And of course, as the day went on, the reason I moved the table up against the house, try to protect it from the wind really started blowing. You can see how strong the wind gusts were. I had thought maybe I'd get a coat of clear on the Buell fairings today, not with the wind blowing like that. So I lived to fight another day, but I did get all the coats of clear over the course of a whole day. And this was a long day of doing things in between coats. But that's the way you can get this to lay down nice. At this time of year, when it's still cold out, the paint takes a little bit longer to dry, and it takes a little bit longer between coats. You can't put a coat on. If this was 80 degrees out, you could put the next coat on in 10 minutes. But in this case, it used up the better part of a day, but I had a lot of other things to do in between. And what I'm really concerned with always, at the end of every job like this, or at the end of every day, I look back at the parts and I try to think, yes, that's the best job I could possibly do with the equipment I have and with the parts, that the condition of the parts when we got them. But I know when Vlad picks these up, I just have a gut feeling he's going to be very, very happy. And the only concern I have is if this paint doesn't hold up well over time. So as per Vlad's instructions, we're getting a lot of the BMW parts painted. The valve covers really look beautiful. I just hope that paint holds up. And again, I tried to put some useful information about high temperature paint. I'm not sure. And again, I don't even know if they painted those valve covers or there's extra resin. But either way, they really look nice. Now, one of the next steps, maybe not the next one, I'm going to check in with Vlad, is this fairing. And he told me this fairing lists for $4,200. My bike collection isn't worth $4,000. But anyway, we will give this our best shot. This looks like it's going to be a real complex piece to paint. We'll probably save this for a dedicated day and make sure that the wind isn't blowing. Today we had that horrible thing. In the middle of the day, the wind just started blowing like a hurricane, but by putting a bench up against the house, we salvaged the day. Anyway, I hope there is some good, useful information on this about the high temperature resins, painting high temperature stuff, and just painting things in general. So this ends V4, standing for Vlad 4. That's the fourth in this series that covers these 3 restorations we're doing at once. At some point in time, you can go back and watch any parts you've missed that way. And we're really looking forward to seeing the first of the projects we want to finish is the BMW, that fairing. There's some other parts there, and there's an extra tail section. This is quite a cool bike, by the way, and very, very rare. And we, as I say before, we're always subject to the weather, and we're always subject to the time restraints we have here in the shop. And thanks so much for watching.